Arirang Special.
Hello and welcome to our viewers all across the globe. Thank you for joining us in Arirang's end of the year special program, Global Outlook 2017. I'm Moon Ganyang. Unexpected, unprecedented, uncharted, but all in all, surreal. Well, the word surreal was looked up so much by users this year that Merriam-Webster dubbed it the 2016 word of the year. In all realms possible, be it politics, economy, society, culture, many around the globe felt the grounds of reality shift beneath them this year. 2016, a year that it was, and looking forward to 2017, how it will be shaped. I want to invite various perspectives on this agenda. Joining us via satellite from Washington, D.C. is Stephen Herman. Steve is a senior diplomatic correspondent at Voice of America. Steve, it's great to see you.
안녕하세요 from Washington.
And Brent Goff, chief news anchor of DW News. Brent joins us from Berlin. Thank you, Brent, for your time today.
Hi, it's good to be with you.
To help us through this review of 2016 and prospects for the year ahead, I have here in our Seoul studio with me Lee Jung-min, professor of international relations at Yonsei University. Thank you so much for coming.
It's a real pleasure.
And Professor Lee Do-won, professor of economics at also Yonsei University. It's great to have you here with us. Now, we're going to get this discussion rolling.
And yes, let us take back control of our borders.
Negotiation with the European Union.
I'm surprised.
Surprised.
I would say shocked, scared.
Embodiment of the American dream.
But because they're ready for a change and they really believe in that opportunity that Donald Trump presents.
To introduce to you the President-elect of the United States of America, Donald Trump.
We will make America great again. Thank you very much, everybody.
A whole lot of events and drama defined 2016, but when reviewing the year, we would have to start with one of the biggest political shocks in modern history. Because the sheer magnitude of shock and sent all across the globe and its wide-ranging implications and ramifications, we begin with Donald Trump being elected as the 45th president of the United States. So we're going to have to begin with you, Steve. It was a surprise outcome, to say the least, defying all polls and, from the perspective of many of us watching from outside of the U.S., defying all odds. Not only was the result unexpected, but it's really shaken U.S. politics to the core, and the consequences are set to be far-reaching. So what is your take on this, and how are you reporting this news to your viewers?
Well, as you said, this is something quite unprecedented, where we're having a president of the United States coming into office who has no political background whatsoever. He's a businessman, obviously, and he ran on a campaign I would say was not only change, but in fact a total overhaul of the system. And I think just like we saw earlier in the year with Brexit in the United Kingdom, a lot of people went out and defied the pollsters, defied what they had told the pollsters, and voted in an opposite way from what was expected. And that has brought a revolutionary change into politics and soon into the White House here in the United States.
Right. So that was the U.S., but, you know, the news out of the U.S., it had implications and shocks all across the globe. Brent, I want to invite you and your perspective on this. So on November 9th, so the day after Election Day in the U.S., how did you carry the news? How was it received by the people there?
I think the reaction here was a lot like the reaction around the world. There was surprise and shock. We were following the polls just like everyone else was, and when the numbers started coming in on election night and we saw that Donald Trump was actually leading in the number of electoral votes, the shock was profound, to say the least. And there has been tremendous concern across Europe, particularly here in Germany, since Election Day about what kind of leader Donald Trump, what kind of president Donald Trump will be. And you saw that immediately following the election. The German chancellor, in a very, some people would say, in a very impersonal way, congratulated Donald Trump at a press conference and said simply that Germany is looking forward to working with its partner, the United States. But she also reminded Donald Trump of the shared values, almost like a scolding, if you will. And President Obama, on his last trip here, to basically say farewell to Europe, there was a lot of talk about the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, now taking on the mantle of the last leader of the free, liberal, democratic world. So huge fallout for Europe because of what happened in the U.S. in November.
Right. I mean, I myself remember delivering the election results here from Seoul, and it was a whole lot of mixture of different emotions, but mostly I think it was a concern that those in South Korea felt about Trump victory. First of all, I want to start with you, Professor Lee. So on the morning of the election day in the U.S., the New York Times had it wrong. New York Times said Hillary Clinton had an 85% chance of winning. Huffington Post said 98%. So that was most likely what we were expecting here in South Korea as well. How would you define or explain this Trump victory in the U.S.?
Well, obviously, all of the experts were wrong on this particular issue, so I read all the same polls that you did. I think it's very important to understand that Donald Trump's victory basically means three things in my mind. Number one, he basically understood the well of angst, and I guess a lot of anger, amongst your ordinary workers who are displaced by globalization. Number two, he felt that the U.S., although it is the policeman of the world, will no longer accept free rides from his perspective. Mm-hmm. And number three, he said, I want to make sure that trade deals and others must serve American interests first. So this was a very strong, I guess, reaffirmation of America first that shook America's allies in the U.S., for example, in the Middle East, in Europe, and also here across Asia.
Right. So mostly for South Koreans, it was national security that they were most concerned about when we learned of Trump victory.
Yes.
And because of what he said during his campaign regarding South Korea-U.S. alliance, but also at the same time, South Korean President Park Geun-hye was one of the first global leaders to have a phone conversation with President-elect Donald Trump. What is your take on that?
Right. Well, Donald Trump said throughout the election campaign that U.S. allies such as Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Germany, basically were not paying their due. And so if he became president, he would ask these allies to pay more for the common defense. But as we all know, the Koreans, I would argue, pay their fair share, as do our Japanese allies. And then there were some remarks about whether he would actually defend South Korea and Japan if there was, for example, a major crisis. In fact, he alluded to the fact that the Japanese and South Koreans may get nuclear weapons, which was okay with him. So he made a number of very boisterous and wrong comments in the campaign. But after he became president-elect, as you said, one of the first phone calls he made was to President Park Geun-hye.
Steve, do you agree with Professor Lee here and his remarks on South Korea-U.S. alliance? Do you think he will basically adopt a new policy that's different from his campaigning pledges?
The answer is we really don't know yet. Will he sort of dictate policy by Twitter, by tweets online after he becomes president? Or will he rely on the National Security Council, the Pentagon, the State Department to put forward a more nuanced policy? I think until after the inauguration and we actually see some implementation of policy, will we get a real clear idea of what's going to happen. Now, obviously, the allies in Northeast Asia, Republic of Korea, Japan, as well as the European allies and NATO are going to push back against any change to the system. And I think also you're going to see the Defense Department, the State Department, and perhaps key staff of the National Security Council push back as well. But the President of the United States is the decider, as a former president said, and we'll just have to wait and see whether he is persuaded by the members of the cabinet and others to keep things in line or to go in a radically different direction, which would upset the world order.
Right. So at this point, we really don't know what kind of a route that President-elect Donald Trump will take and what kind of global ramifications that will have for the rest of the world. Professor Lee briefly touched upon trade protectionism, about free trade deals that Donald Trump, in fact, said. I think at one point he called South Korea-U.S. free trade deal a job-killing deal for the U.S. What are your prospects of the Korea-U.S. FTA under Trump administration?
Well, you just mentioned that there are lots of uncertainties in terms of the policies after Trump got elected. But there's a couple of things that we can easily predict. One thing is that this was the result of a populism. Both the winning of the Trump and the Brexit was a result of popular vote. And we underestimated the power of the populism, how strong it is, how sweet it is to the general public. And the thing is, the populism, the emergence of the populism policies, especially economic policies, has come to the global economy and also to the South Korean economy at the very, very worst time. We are still at fairly fragile situation. We are still recovering from the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. This is not the time to rely on populism and then protectionism as well. The protectionism was also emerging from the populism. And protectionism, Mr. Trump promised many things about the free trade agreement. He said that he will probably fix it again. But after he got elected, especially when he was talking with President Park Geun-hye,
Right.
he didn't mention about Korea-USA FTA. And he still does not mention about Korea-USA FTA. He has vaguely mentioned about NAFTA, but one thing was certain. He will make sure to abolish TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right.
So that is for sure. But with regard to the existing FTA, we still do not know for sure how strong and how far he will go.
I want to really come back to the issue of TPP in just a bit, but just for the flow's sake, I want to touch upon Brexit. So in somewhat of a similar vein, we saw another unexpected vote result, which was in Europe, in the UK, and it was, of course, Britain's vote to leave the European Union. This too was not expected. First, Brent, what would you say are the driving factors behind that result?
Well, I think it's important when we talk about Europe, you can almost talk about the pre and the post-Brexit Europe. Brexit was also like the U.S. election. The polls didn't see it coming. The reporting on it was completely off as well. And when it was done and over, we were back at this angst about globalization and immigration. When the Brexit campaign began, it's important to remember the Brexiteers were not talking about immigration. They were talking about other things such as jobs, such as trade, and they were talking about Britain's right to rule itself. But immigration was not number one on the agenda. And UKIP moved in with Nigel Farage, and they took the migration crisis and turned it into the number one Brexiteer cause. And that is what gave them enough votes to win. And we've been reeling from that ever since. I mean, it's now, we're in a new year, and it's been 6 months since the Brexit referendum. We still don't know what Brexit is going to look like. And the Brexiteers, the people who led that campaign, they've either resigned, such as Nigel Farage, or they're now the foreign minister, such as Boris Johnson. But a plan for a life outside of the European Union for Britain, we're still waiting for the blueprint of that.
Well, I think we are seeing a common theme here between the winning of Donald Trump as a U.S. president and Brexit, both that they both won based on the support of populism and, of course, I suppose, protectionism in every sense possible, and also now unpredictability. We don't know how this will impact the global order. Steve, I'm curious to know how you reported on Brexit following the Brexit vote.
Well, of course, that was a surprise to people here in the United States as much as the victory of Donald Trump was a surprise to the rest of the world. And I think that was the first indication to people here that something was a bit amiss about this year. And to some, a few who publicly predicted that on the heels of Brexit, we could see a big surprise in the presidential election here in the United States as well, which of course we did. Obviously, just as has been the case in the United Kingdom, we've also seen in the United States during the campaign tapping in to what the professor referred to as this protectionism atmosphere, a bit of isolationism. People here in the United States worried about these international trade deals taking their jobs away. And I think what is very interesting to note is that in the presidential election, it was the two top Democratic candidates, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, who both opposed TPP. And Donald Trump obviously appealed to a lot of Democratic voters. So that did come on the heels of Brexit. And I think we can see some sort of connection across the Atlantic.
So I think what we're seeing really is a more and more nationalist and populist parties on the rise. And both Brexit and the U.S. election can also be seen as somewhat of an offshoot of that. How should this be interpreted, and how should we here in South Korea be taking this in and understanding it in a way and perhaps better preparing our future?
You know, first of all, if you take Brexit or the election of Donald Trump, it means the key critical question is, how will the West lead? And the world faces a slew of problems. As soon as Donald Trump walks into the Oval Office in January, he will have Syria to deal with. He's got to contend with a much more aggressive China in the South China Sea. He's got to deal with the refugee problem. He's got to deal with a much more resurgent Russia. He's got to deal with ISIL. And so in all of these global issues, if you don't have steadfast American or European leadership, the rest of the world will suffer, including, for example, key allies here in Asia. And apropos what our commentators said about Brexit, I think it's important to understand that the UK Foreign Secretary at a meeting in Bahrain a few weeks ago, about 10 days ago, said that the UK will take a much more forceful action now in the Middle East. Well, that's good news. But if Britain removes itself outside of the EU, I think it will have a much lower foreign policy profile, and thus overall a much weaker Western leadership might be over the horizon.
Right, and do you have a take on this as well?
Well, I think I'm going to mention about the implication of this protectionism on South Korean economy and the emerging economies as well. You know, as I told you, the protectionism is coming at the very worst time, very bad time of the global economy. So as an emerging economy, South Korea needs to emphasize that we need more open economic system at a time like this, at a time when the global economy is still very fragile. And we need to emphasize that actually a lot of consumers and low-income families, even in a country like USA, they were actually the beneficiary of more open economic system. So if USA turn more into protectionism, actually it may help the US economy in the short term. However, in the long run, it will be the US consumers, especially the low-income family consumers, who get actually harmed the most. We need to emphasize that, but still, I think it will be inevitable that some kinds of protectionism is going to rise in the near future, so we need to get prepared for that.
Right, Steve, I'm going to ask you this question. Do you agree with Professor Lee here about protectionism really, in the longer term, harming U.S. consumers, the lower income class in the long run?
Well, I think a lot of economists do agree with that perspective. There's an argument that a lot of these jobs in the so-called Rust Belt that candidates like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump vowed to bring back are really not going to come back to the United States in any great numbers because we're in a post-industrial age. So what's very interesting is when candidates get into office as presidents and they deal with economic realities, and there are all sorts of things that crop up, and how they have to fine-tune their economic policy, it can be significantly different than what they were advocating on the campaign trail.
Right. Brent, I want to find out how Europe is taking all this. So basically, Donald Trump's victory, that could mean economic trade barriers there for Europe. And with Brexit, that also means UK and the rest of the European Union countries will no longer enjoy trade barrier-free economic relations.
That's true. And it's also important to remember that Donald Trump's campaign, this wasn't the first time that we heard voices calling for some sort of protectionism, or voices who are saying we should be wary of greater free trade deals. We have those voices here in Europe as well. You know, a couple of examples, there was a free trade deal that was just recently passed between the European Union and Canada. It barely passed, and, you know, it was just a very small area in Belgium that was holding out on passing it in the legislature there, and it would have shot down the entire deal. And we know that with TTIP, which is the transatlantic trade deal that has been in negotiations now for years, it's going to lose a lot of the momentum that it had from the White House under President Obama. If we have President Trump saying that he is not pushing for it, that he's against it, or he's just going to let it languish there, then you're going to lose most of the drive that was behind that on that side of the Atlantic. I don't think there's much drive on this side of the Atlantic to compensate for that. And let me pick up on one issue about what happened after Trump was elected in November, and this notion of no more free rides. He was speaking directly to the European members of NATO on that, and the fact that many of them do not spend 2% of their GDP on defense as they've promised to do in NATO. And I'll tell you what happened immediately after Election Day. There was an emergency session of the European Union called, and you had all members of the European Union agreeing to increase their common defense plan strategy policy, realizing that the United States, come 2017, may not be the partner with that big protective umbrella that they've taken for granted for so long.
Right, and this increasingly nationalism or protectionism, I suppose, growing all across the globe that we're seeing this trend. I'd like to ask an open question to all of you. With Trump now threatening to pull out of the TPP, and Professor Lee, you said that you do believe that Trump will just pull out of these talks because it hasn't been initiated yet. And other FTAs, although the existing ones could last, there is also a possibility of Donald Trump scrapping that as well. Does this present a new opportunity for China?
In both ways, yes and no, because China will also face a very serious challenge because of the new policy of the Trump. You know, as Trump imposed protectionism, especially on China, you know, Mr. Trump openly mentioned about imposing retaliatory tariffs, something like 44% on Chinese import. If that actually take place, that would be a big blow to the Chinese export sector. But anyway, that may not be realized in the near future. Even though it is materialized, it's not going to be 44%, but probably 10%. But still, it's a big challenge to China. On the other hand, however, this can be a good opportunity for China to seize more leadership in Asian region in terms of the RCEP and also AIIB.
Right.
No, so far, before Trump was elected, RCEP was not exactly a serious match to TPP.
Right.
And AIIB was regarded as kind of a complementary body to existing multinational organizations such as IMF or World Bank. But now that TPP is almost abolished, Now that the role of the international organization got weakened, now more and more Asian countries, even some European countries, they will rely more on the leadership of China under RCEP and AIIB.
You know, and this will have huge, I think, political repercussions because over the last 70 so years since World War II, the liberal international order was maintained by American leadership in two bold fronts: on security, by offering protection to its allies, and by leading the free world insofar as free markets were concerned. So if the US pushes back and China rises, it will not only have economic repercussions, because already all of America's allies in Asia trade more with China than the US. But this will have political repercussions.
Sure.
So it may weaken America's posture. You know, Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, spearheaded the so-called pivot to Asia. Now nobody's saying where would the pivot go? You know, Trump might want to repivot to another region we don't really know. At the recent APEC meeting, for example, Xi Jinping was the one who basically spoke boldly about trade issues. And I think as a result, Trump must realize that the only way you will make America great again is to have great friends across Asia and particularly in Europe. So without great friends, you cannot have a great America.
Right, and it certainly does not seem like, Steve, that Donald Trump is out to make more friends, if not cut off the ones that he already had. Steve, do you want to pitch an idea in that as well about China and the U.S.? And of course, you know, here in Asia, there has always been that, you know, that hegemony, I suppose. But now that world order could change under Trump.
Right. Yeah, I think the big question is, will Donald Trump want to be seen as the president who ceded America's influence in Asia to China? A lot of the rhetoric, I think you have to take in the vein of him being a businessman. And you talk, you bluster, but behind the scenes you try to negotiate a most effective deal. And I think we'll see the same thing with the relationship between the United States and China. He may say a lot of things in public, but what gets negotiated behind closed doors, both China and the United States, I think, want to keep both the economic and the security relationship on an even keel. There's always going to be tension. There is tension, and there has been tension for decades, and that's not going to be changed. And that's not going to change. But how they actually negotiate away from the cameras, away from Twitter, I think will really determine the direction of the relationship.
Right. I think really we should all remember that Trump is, in fact, a good businessman, a successful one too. So, you know, he might be adopting his, business strategies. But I think the fact stands that, closing 2016, we're at a crossroads of various uncertainties, various unpredictable events that may or may not unfold before our eyes leading up to the new year. And I think 2017 will surely be quite an interesting time with respect to global economy as Donald Trump takes office. You're watching Arirang's end-of-year special program, Global Outlook 2017. When we come back, we will hear more from DW, VOA, and our two experts on global forecasts of 2017. We'll be back right after this.
I'm short. I'm going to... Signature today is...
주체의 선건 혁명 여부를
In the event of another nuclear test by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
에서도 승리한 군사적 이성을 알게 돼.
Welcome back. You're watching Arirang's end of year special roundtable debate reflecting on 2016 and prospects for the new year. Via satellite are Stephen Herman from VOA connecting with us from Washington, D.C., Brent Goff of DW News with us from Berlin, and of course my two experts on global issues, Professor Lee Jung-min of Yonsei University and also Professor Lee Du-won of Yonsei University as well. Now, gentlemen, let's pick up where we left off. So we left off with China. It seems to me that China and U.S. are, again, really going head-to-head on this. Trump calling Taiwan, tweeting about their trade policies. What do you make of these actions?
I think the phone call with the Taiwanese president was planned well before Trump was won the victory. I don't think this is going to be a huge issue because he realizes that without China's help, you cannot help resolve the North Korean nuclear issue. You cannot fight climate change. You cannot resolve the disputes, for example, in the East China Sea or the South China Sea. And so everywhere China is, it has enough power to constrain or even deny America in this region. So as a result, Trump needs to work very closely with the Chinese.
Just out of curiosity, Brent, so when we talk about China, there are a lot of talks with China vis-a-vis U.S., China vis-a-vis Northeast Asia, China and South Korea. And to me, it seems like Europe is more or less left out of these talks. How is China being received in Europe, and what is your view on China-Europe relations?
Yeah, I mean, that perception probably has a lot to do with the stories that are reported, but the connections between Europe and China are great. I mean, the entire trading economy of Germany is dependent on free global trade, and a lot of that means doing business with China. And you've seen European leaders, particularly the German Chancellor, come out and say that they will not be changing their one China policy stance, despite what they saw with Trump and the president of Taiwan. There is a high regard here for the stability of the economic relationships that have been built between China and Europe, between all of Eastern, Southeastern Asia and Europe over the last 3 decades. You're not going to find any voices here saying that they want to tamper with that. So perhaps that's one reason why the reporting seems to always center on the U.S. and China. It's business as usual for the most part between the EU and China right now.
Right. So when we talk about China, it seems like China really holds the key as we move forward to 2017 in terms of economic relations, the global economy, as well as, of course, North Korea. So China is vital in resolving the North Korean nuclear issue. What is your assessment of the North Korean nuclear issue this year? Of course, we've seen the most number of provocations from North Korea this year. We've had 2 nuclear tests, numerous missile provocations to South Korea. Where are we right now in terms of the North Korean nuclear equation where we stand in 2016 today?
I think this will depend on a number of issues. Number one, as you know, South Korea is in the midst of its biggest political crisis over the last 30, 40 years. So when a new South Korean government emerges sometime in the early part of 2017, that government will have a different, perhaps, North Korea policy than under the Park Geun-hye government. But having said that, North Korea may do another nuclear test. It will certainly provide more provocation to South Korea. But the critical issue is Kim Jong-un has been in power for 5 years. So he's not going to be, gone anytime soon. Although we are also seeing very different trends within North Korea, greater defections of high-level officials, more than 30,000 North Korean defectors living in South Korea. So the system is changing within North Korea. But I think for the time being, Kim Jong-un wants to make sure that he wants his nuclear weapons and economic growth at the same time.
Right. So in terms of the North Korea's nuclear provocations, we have seen UNSC measures, UN Security Council measures, so on a unilateral level. Of course, the U.S., South Korea, of course, Japan, and I think, Brent, Europe as well, European Union, they've actually slapped unilateral sanctions on North Korea as well. Every time I hear sanctions on North Korea's nuclear issues, I seem to hear that this is the harshest ever. So I don't know how much further we can go in terms of the degree of how much pain North Korea will feel because of this sanctions.
That's a very good problem. I'm sure others can chip in. But the key issue is we've got to really focus on secondary sanctions. And I think Trump will go down that road. And so if you're able to cut off the oxygen, which supports North Korea, which is hard currency, that is going to have a huge impact on the regime. And I think if that goes really according to plan, the Chinese will become very nervous, and it remains to be seen whether Xi Jinping will actually support much strident, much stronger financial sanctions on North Korea.
Another thing that we missed in terms of the economic sanctions on North Korea was China. So long as China do not cooperate, then all the other economic sanctions on North Korea would not be effective. Basically, China is the only trading partner to North Korean regime, and North Korea actually rely more and more on international trade with China. That's the official part of this story. But if you look at the unofficial part, all those smuggling businesses between the North Korean and Chinese borders are actually increasing. We have seen a lot of evidences that at the peasant market of North Korea, more and more Chinese products are replacing other countries' products. And the daily life of the North Korean consumers heavily depend on Chinese products, not to mention all those strategic supply of oils and all the other heavy equipment from China. So long as China keep on providing all those support to North Korea, any other economic sanction would not work as effectively.
Right, but on the surface, we have seen China pledging numerous times that it will go ahead and abide by the UNSC, UN Security Council sanctions. We've actually seen the latest measures on China and North Korea vis-a-vis North Korea was that we're cutting off the coal exports that can be exported to China from North Korea. Steve, feel free to pitch in because amongst all of us here, you're the only one who's actually been to North Korea. So do you have a take on this?
Well, I think what's going to be very interesting in this next administration here in Washington is one day probably the CIA director is going to walk into the White House. He's going to plunk down a big classified report on the desk of the president in the Oval Office. And he's going to say that North Korea now, we believe, has the capability to mount a miniaturized nuclear weapon on a ballistic missile capable of hitting bases of the United States. And then President Trump is going to have to decide what to do. As you've all noted, sanctions have been applied, have not dissuaded the North Koreans from launching ballistic missile tests and continuing with the nuclear weapons tests. And what pressure is the United States under President Trump going to apply on the Chinese? And will the Chinese comply or will the Chinese push back? Because, of course, if and when North Korea collapses, it's a big problem for South Korea, obviously, but it's perhaps an even greater problem with refugees and security for China. So China has wanted the status quo to stay in place, but will that be able to stay in place for the next 4 years?
Like I said, European Union was also one of the first to slap sanctions, unilateral sanctions, aside from the multilateral sanctions that UNSC has imposed on North Korea. How much of a threat is North Korea's nuclear weapons to Europe, to Germany? How are you feeling there?
Well, I mean, Europe has been following the U.S. lead on this, and I think it's interesting what Steve just said about Trump listening to what his intelligence agency leaders tell him. We don't know if he's going to do that right now, do we? We know that he doesn't hold them in high regard as it stands right now. So let's say they do say that, and we are talking about a nuclear-capable North Korea, and a President Trump will have to decide what to do. Will he have all the information that a U.S. president, that the leader of a superpower should have, is one question. And what are his alternatives then? I think we got a little taste of that when the internet went out suddenly in North Korea, and that sources in Washington have told us that that was probably a message from the United States that there are other ways beyond sanctions to enforce a certain behavior on North Korea. Perhaps that will be an option for the United States if we get to that point. But again, the new president is going to have to rely on his intelligence people. And as it stands right now, he's not going to have much of an open ear for them.
You know, one thing we should understand is that Mr. Trump has sold himself as a very successful businessman, and he feels that he can negotiate with almost anybody. I guarantee you that he will have a tough time negotiating with the Chinese. Xi Jinping will not buckle down and listen to Donald Trump just because he's Donald Trump. And so if Donald Trump thinks that Xi Jinping will push the button and apply more pressure on North Korea, I think Donald Trump will be pleasantly surprised.
You know, one of the key issues or interesting points that we should be on the lookout for is Donald Trump's take on Kim Jong-un. I think many of us have reported that Donald Trump factor could be a negative in terms of solving the North Korea problem, but at the same time, Donald Trump might be the only one bold enough to actually go and meet Kim Jong-un face to face and iron out a deal. Steve, your take on that?
Well, I think Donald Trump's going to be advised, if he decides he wants to do that, not to do it unless there is a takeaway that can be agreed to before he shows up in Pyongyang. Presumably that's where any such meeting would be held. But I think that is such a hypothetical at this point. But one thing I think that's really important to keep in mind with the North Koreans is that they want to be taken seriously. They are looking for attention, and whether it's setting off nuclear weapons tests or launching more ballistic missiles, they want attention, they want to be a player, they want to have respect from the United States. And so obviously at least giving them some attention may mitigate some of the tension that we've been seeing.
Right. So as we wrap up 2016 and move into 2017, professors, where do we stand in terms of inter-Korean relations? Of course, the joint industrial complex, Kaesong Industrial Complex, shut down earlier this year. So we have absolutely no relations with North Korea. South Korea does not have one at this point. It was, in fact, even hard for them to get in touch with the regime when South Korea tried to return these sailors, North Korean sailors that were rescued from waters. Where do we stand in terms of inter-Korean relations?
Well, economically speaking, so far, South Korean government, including the Park Geun-hye government, has maintained a policy to distinguish between North Korean people and North Korean regime. So, in one hand, we try to help North Korean people by providing all those humanitarian aids, and that includes actually Kaesong Industrial Complex. But on the other hand, we try to punish the wrong behavior, the bad behavior of the North Korean regime. The thing is, this strategy so far didn't work, especially in terms of the punishment. It seems like the North Korea, economically speaking, was not punished at all, thanks to mostly to China. And it seems like that all those efforts of the South Korean government and South Korean NGOs to help North Korean people was not quite successful as well. North Korean people, they found their own way to survive, and even without Kaesong Industrial Complex, it seems like that their economy is actually going on relatively well. So I think we really have to find a new strategy to deal with North Korea, both North Korean regime and North Korean people.
You know, there are a number of security issues here. We have a growing North Korean nuclear threat. They're going to have submarines with ballistic missiles. And as our friends in Washington, D.C. said, the North Koreans probably have already miniaturized nuclear warheads for delivery on ICBMs. So this is a very, very crucial threat. But the problem is the Korean government, the Park Geun-hye government now is in, as I said earlier, its biggest political problem. And so we will not have a new North Korea policy until we are able to resolve our outstanding political problems. Once that is resolved, then the new government can sit down with Washington and with our other allies and partners in the region, as well as China, and draft a very new North Korea policy.
Right, so it certainly looks like we'll have to wait it out and see, because at the moment, South Korea, we're in a transition to the next government. U.S., we're going to be seeing Donald Trump take office, and we'll have to wait and see how he will carry out his policies. And I know that, Brent, that Germany has elections coming up with other European countries as well.
That's right. I mean, you've got a lot of things that will come together in 2017. Some people saying it's the perfect storm against the European project that we could see in 2017. You've got the momentum of the Trump train, if you will, this anti-establishment, angry voter. You've got that on one side. On the other side, you've got a very, very strong-arming Russia that is open about its willingness to destabilize Western alliances and Western allegiances. All of this coming from both sides, and then you've got elections here in Germany, in France, and in the Netherlands, and possibly also in Italy, the core countries of the European Union. And you've got populist parties, nationalist parties in all of these countries that are enjoying an incredibly strong tailwind from the public. And you could possibly see a new constellation here. I don't think we're talking about the far right coming into government here in Germany, but still a message being sent to the new government that a change is necessary. And there is talk now, because of the terror attack that took place here in Berlin on a Christmas market, that the days of the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, they could be numbered as well. She has been able to weather the storm that her critics say was created by her open door policy with refugees. We'll have to see if she can continue to do that when elections come.
I think it's really this inability to make projections, to look into immediate future, 2017, is what's really unsettling at this point.
It is unsettling, but in a nutshell, Trump will not be as bad as people think. And Korea's crisis will be, in the next year or so, be resolved. And so over the longer term, I'm more optimistic that there will be more common ground between America and the U.S. And with our allies in the region. And so I would not be that worried looking into 2017.
When I started this broadcast, I said 2016, we could really sum it up in one word: surreal. Uncharted, unpredicted. Steve, do you have a key word for 2017 that you're expecting it to become the word of the year?
The word of the year for 2017, uncertainty. I think it is a year of uncertainty and perhaps maybe transition, for the better, for the worse. We don't know yet.
All right, Brent, what about for you? Key word for 2017 for you?
Change, for sure. I think that what we've seen with Brexit, what we've seen in the United States, I think there is the feeling that that is going to come to the continent as well, and that the European Union, as we know it today, could be fundamentally changed. And some are saying that the worst case scenario is that it could be no more by the end of the year. We don't know. We do know that the core members of the European Union have key elections in 2017. We don't know how those elections will turn out, but if they have the same ingredients as what we've seen with Brexit and with the Trump election, and if you add fake news and hacking attacks, if all that comes together into a perfect storm, we definitely will be dealing with change in Europe, something that we have not seen in 70 years.
Right. So I think our friends in Berlin and Washington, D.C. have said change and transition are some of the key words that will shape 2017. I'd like closing words from you, Professor Lee-Du Won, on the economic outlook for 2017.
Well, we need to prepare for the new environment. All these policies of USA and also China as well, and other European countries, are heading into one direction. More and more global economies, especially the large countries, will rely more and more on domestic demand and less on international trade and investment. And that will be the inevitable trend that we probably will have to follow. At the same time, there are some positive news coming. The so-called fourth industrial revolution is coming, and Korea is probably at a very good position to take advantage of this. So we need to get prepared.
And you, Professor Lee Jung-min?
Well, there's going to be profound change, which requires profound patience. And so I think Koreans, as I said earlier, we've gone through so many crises over the last 70 years, we can weather a few more.
Well, I think we all agree on the fact that whether we can weather or not, there will be change coming up for us to deal with in the new year. But I think the key word here, I think for all of us, is really adaptability. We need to adapt to new changes, new environments, and a new future. That's just about all the time we have. So first off, I'd like to thank Steve, who's been out in the cold for an hour now. Steve Herman, Senior Diplomatic Correspondent at VOA in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome.
And Brent, to you as well. Brent Goff of DW in Berlin, despite technical difficulty. Thank you for being there with me.
Thank you. And from all of us here in Berlin, we're wishing you a happy and prosperous 2017.
And to you too. And of course, my two experts here in my Seoul studio, Professor Lee Jung-min, Professor of International Relations at Yonsei University. Thank you so much for your insights. And Professor Lee Du-won, of course, for your insights as well. And to you, our viewers, all of you watching, happy holidays. And we'll see you in the new year with even more complicated, it seems, global order in 2017. Bye-bye for now.